hardest part of starting is starting, right? And figuring out which idea to work on, right? I think generally you probably all have a vision of some kind. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. And I feel like the process of entrepreneurship is often, figuring out an idea that, or sort of like a space in which you want to operate in, and then sort of staying in it long enough to figure out the most simple version of what you're interested in. So you're all obviously here because you're interested in health, right? And then there's some segment of health that really sort of fascinates you and you see an opportunity inside. And I think that the beginning is always that way. I think that you also end up working on something that you know a lot about, and you may not know you know a lot about it, but or that you've sort of thought about for a really long time. And one of the things that I've sort of worked on, social technology, social networks, web stuff for, basically my whole life. I've been on every single social network there's ever been, whether it's been Prodigy or CompuServe or ICQ or IRC or Gopher or, the original BBS systems, like all this kind of stuff. I've been a member of all of them. And one of the things that I remembered from the early phases of all of those was this really awesome time when it was very small and intimate. And so I was thinking the big sort of idea I guess I had was taking that moment in time in a network where it's super intimate and super personal and just locking it in and keeping it that way forever. And so that was kind of the main sort of thesis that I've had on PATH since day one. And if we could sort of create that environment, then it would be this really high fidelity, really high quality sharing experience, and this way to sort of stay connected to the right, the people you love, people you care about, not just sort of everyone you've ever met in your life, and that would be this sort of more personal network. And the idea of just kind of locking it in place, and not necessarily always the same people, but maybe the right people, all throughout your life. That could be a really interesting experience. And so we've been thinking a lot about that since the beginning. But I guess I tell you all those stories to tell you the story that I think the process of starting is often just taking a look at broad swaths of data and looking for patterns and trying to figure out okay, now's the time to land this idea.
And then in the time between the first version hitting the App Store and you looking at that data, how many iterations did you move through of this concept?
After we launched V1?
No, after you looked at the data.
Oh.
There's a gap there. How was that process for you?
We started out with a completely different implementation. So the original version of PATH was actually just you take a photo with the stock camera that comes with the iPhone SDK, and then pop open an email, and then you could type into the email with the photo attached, and then the software would automatically attach the little Google map into the email, and then it would send it to this email list that you had curated. And that was it. And that was the first version of PATH. And we actually learned a whole bunch of things about what people would post based on that. People would post music, they'd post photos of what they were doing, they'd post photos of who they were with. And so we looked at all of the data around how people were using it. They'd post photos of the radio when they were in the car, and so there'd be this awesome pivot on the data around, I'm listening to this song and I'm driving down the Highway 1, right? And so we tried to kind of start to take what we saw in that behavior from this very early version. We actually called it PATH Capture. What was this called? Capture. It was this iPhone app. And we took that data, and I would say we probably did maybe 5 iterations, I guess, between that early version and then the version that we released into the App Store in November of 2010.
Did you know when
Does that
something...
answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And how did you know when something wasn't working or when to kill something?
It's really hard, actually, in the first version. That's kind of one of the, if I could leave you with one thing, I guess. We released this first version of PATH, and we had all these assumptions, and it had been through this process of, okay, we created this really simple little thing that sent emails, and then we turned it into an application. We built a cloud, and we started getting everything going. But the first version, we had a whole lot of things we were in love with. I guess I tell this story is there's all these conceptual things you fall in love with, right? When you're building a product, and And then you sort of merge it all together, and you're getting good feedback from the customers and your beta testers, and then you decide like, all right, I think this is pretty good. And in our case, we like flew to New York and like showed it to Walt Mossberg, and we're like, this is the future, you know. And there was a bunch of things that were good and a lot of things that were bad. And I think that's the reality of launching anything, right? Like you sort of like get as far along as you can to where you think you've got like a really good version that's ready to go, and then you have to push it out the door. And Reid Hoffman has this thing like, if you're not embarrassed of your product, you waited too long, right?
Do you believe that?
I do to some extent. I think that it's worth taking. In hindsight, I think I would have taken a little bit extra time. It depends on the medium too, right? Like on the web, it's easier to push out something that isn't as far along as you'd like it to be. But the lesson I've learned in the App Store is it's like as unforgiving as launching a movie, right? Like you really, really want to make sure your bows are tied up in the App Store, because you can't change anything for like 2 weeks, right? And so if there's a bunch of rough edges, like it's really hard to get an iteration out there before customers are like, this sucks, and you've got, you know, 2,000 2-star reviews. And so I think developing for mobile is a little bit harder, just because you have to really package it up nicely, and you know, you've got to have a nice user experience, a new user experience, because there's no personalization of the app. Everyone downloads the same version of the app, and so you can't do the kind of stuff that you can on the web. And so it takes a little bit more care than it otherwise would, I guess.
So PATH is, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, about like a place for trust. Mm-hmm. And for all of us building healthcare products, having empathy and that compassion within a product is a real challenge. How do you think about building trust and empathy and compassion and emotions into the same app that everyone downloads?
The other thing that you think about a lot, which will inform the entire future of your company in these formative days, is what your values are. Right? Like what are the values on which you make decisions, right? And at PATH, it came down to some simple things. You know, it usually comes down to like 3 to 5 concepts or conceptual things that like, these are our values, right? And at PATH, you know, we really wanted it to be very simple, right? And simple doesn't always mean that it's just clutter-free. It means that you've spent enough time going through a problem to get to the solution that ultimately feels inevitable, right? Like simplicity means that when the user touches it, they're like, oh, why didn't I think of that, right? Or oh, they didn't even have to think about it. They're just using it, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that it's like clutter-free or there's less buttons or anything like that. It means that you spent enough time in the problem to get to inevitability, right? And we also cared a lot about privacy, you know, and trust. And those were things that we really wanted to make decisions based on those things. Like we wanted that to be a core value of the company, right? And so those things begin to inform like all the decisions downstream. I remember back still to this day to the first 3 months of PATH. I just sat there many late nights looking at a single one-page Word document or Google Doc that had our values in it. And I would sit there and I'd iterate through them, and I'd have like the core value in bold and then 2 or 3 sentences underneath each one. And I still do that to this day. You know, I'm like, I look at them, I'm like, is this, you know, and to this day, like we're pretty solid on what the top bold word is, right? But the individual's descriptions, I feel like I'm constantly synthesizing and trying to make sure that providing a clear communication of what that value means is really important, because those are the things that inform the culture.
What have you learned since you integrated Nike Plus into PATH?
The initial product was all focused on photos, but people would do really interesting things with the product. They would screenshot different apps using the iPhone screenshot functionality and then upload them to PATH. So we started looking at talking to users and looking at the data in aggregate, and we were like, whoa, there's like all these screenshots of different apps. And one of the most popular types was the running map. We were like, oh, that's pretty crazy. And it was like Nike plus GPS, right? And so we completely redesigned the product around the data that we saw and the behavior that we saw. If I learned one thing at Facebook the whole time, was that if people are trying to do something with your product, like get out of their way, right? In terms of the content that people were creating, we were actually just getting in their way often, right? We were like, yeah, put all these tags on here and do all this stuff. And people didn't want to do that. They just wanted to screenshot an app and put it in there. And they actually wanted, was producing screenshots of apps, which we had envisioned being part of this more trusted network. And so as we kind of came along to actually doing this, we actually ended up having, the ironic thing is Nike reached out to us and said, you guys have this trusted network, it's family, and like, we're all about quality. And the reason that we ended up at Nike was less, it was part about the product and the network that we were trying to create, but also it was about our values. And when we walked in there, I was like, we're just a little Path, right? And we're no Facebook, right? We're no Twitter. We're not even really a Foursquare. And they're like, well, you guys clearly care about quality.
You talk a lot about data-driven decision making. What does your analytics setup look like?
So we have gone through a variety of different ways of looking at that. We started out building our own stuff, using like open source analytics packages to draw graphs and things. We ultimately ended up using Mixpanel a lot, which I don't know how many of you guys have used Mixpanel. It's a good tool, and it's really actually only good for engagement though. It sort of helps you understand how people are using your product, and you can do a lot with it, but it's all real time, so that's really nice. And I think it actually would be good for early stage too, because it's just really simple, and you sort of hit these APIs, and it makes it a lot easier. We also we've ended up building out. We're actually in the process of it right now. We're building out more growth-related analytics stuff, and we're having to do that kind of ourselves, because there's not any really good products in the market like that are a service that help you really understand like how your product is growing and why, and how your conversion rates are on like other networks and things like that. So we're working out some of that. We also use this great tool called Gecko Board, which lets you take Mixpanel data and flow it into these dashboards, which can kind of be inspiring for your team to look at. And one of them actually shows a map of all your users all over the world, and you can kind of drag and drop and reconfigure all this stuff. I really love it. So we've got, once you get an office, you can put plasmas up and stuff, and that gets fun. But it's a great tool. So that's basically our analytics stuff. But honestly, when you talk about data-driven decision making, it's not necessarily about the everyday metrics. It's about trying to figure out behavior in the data, right? And that can come through looking at actual data in your databases, or it can come through interviewing users and trying to figure out, this person's a really engaged user of my product. Why? I think oftentimes it's the unorthodox things that aren't obvious in the aggregate data, which tell you actually like what you need to unlock, right? And so that can be a process of just trying to figure out some like interesting patterns that you didn't expect, and then try to sort of like unlock them and see if that causes a boost in engagement.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and we'll open it up. You talked earlier about the difficulty after path one, or I think you used the word failure. How did you deal with that? What did you learn through that process?
This actually happens a lot in the startup world. You'll look around and you'll see that there's a lot of people that have 10 to 20,000 DAU on mobile, especially. I think that like you can actually sort of get to that level, and generally I think that's actually it's actually a good sign that you've got that many. I mean, 10,000, 20,000 people, that's more than my whole hometown, right? Using the product on a daily basis, right? Like, I think that's one of the hard things that we, in the internet world, we do. We're like, oh, it's not millions yet, so I've failed, right? it's not a total failure, right? Like I said, you started for some reason because you've got a vision. Like you see, like your brain is seeing an opening that there is something there. And oftentimes what you have to do is like, I think of entrepreneurship as this concentric circles model where like you launch something and you get like a certain number of users, right? And like your goal is to figure out like how to simplify what it is that you launched to get it to like another set and then another set. And sometimes you can make that process exponential, but predominantly you can't make it exponential, right? Like you've kind of got to like keep expanding. And so I think that often that's just a simplification process because whatever it is that you launch the first time is usually just way too complicated, right? And so you've got to go and figure out, all right, which parts of it are completely working? Let's like make that a bigger percentage of the product, and then let's cut out the stuff that's not working, and sort of take the approach that nothing's sacred, right? And that the goal is to get to the most simplified version of your vision.